Hello and welcome to Michael's Minty Music for today. Today we review the soundtrack for the 1980 movie Flash Gordon, written and performed by Queen. It's pretty high quality for a soundtrack. I've never seen the full movie here, but I've heard it's kind of all right. The soundtrack is definitely the more impactful of the two things. This is the track listing. And these are the tracks that added to my playlist. Now 9 out of 18, so exactly half here. That's actually a lot more than most soundtrack albums. Most of them have a lot of ambient music that doesn't play well outside of their original context. Especially video game soundtracks have a lot of, tracks that aren't good on their own. So with an album of 50 tracks, you might only take 10. But for here, we've got about half of them that are all good on their own. The flow is decent. It's following a pacing of the movie, so that's to be expected. It's kind of hard to have a soundtrack that doesn't have decent flow, especially for a movie or a show. Side 1 is slower and it's got more setup, while Side 2 is the sort of climactic finale of the movie, I believe. The slow tracks don't really show off Queen's strength and aren't great, so they don't sound particularly interesting outside the movie. But in contrast, all the quicker rock-oriented tracks are good, and they work well on their own outside of the soundtrack. So it's kind of good overall. Especially the last couple of tracks are all good and work well together. They basically take the flow right from the end of the movie, which is sort of this climactic finale, which is pretty good. There was only one single released before the album, the opening theme from the movie, Flash's theme, sometimes just called Flash. It's probably the only track you might know here. I think it was used in a couple of different places after the movie, and it's kind of a very anthemic song. My favorite track here, though, probably Football Fight. It's weirdly kind of like an instrumental version of some of Queen's harder rock tracks from their early 70s work, and it works really well. Definitely one of the better instrumental tracks here. Although Battle Theme and, of course, the opening theme are also really good. I ranked this album 13th out of Queen's 15 albums, only over their debut album and their 1991 album Innuendo. Flash Gordon as a soundtrack is automatically not as good as most of their decent albums. It's only slightly better than their two albums which are not great, which in my opinion are their first one and Innuendo. Both of them have some tracks on them which aren't good, and they don't flow well. In contrast, Flash Gordon has mostly only decent tracks on it, and flows decently, so it ends up a bit higher, but it doesn't really beat out any sort of full albums from Queen. Additionally, this album doesn't take my top spot from 1980. That goes to a much more traditional album, Billy Joel's Glass Houses, which is definitely better than Flash Gordon, and there are a lot of other albums from 1980 that would come in better than Flash Gordon, so it's not even really that close here. This is sort of just a soundtrack album from the time period, which is good, but not my favorite from the year. Next up is Talking Heads' 1980 album, Remain in Light. It's got a weird cover, but I think this is the album with their first really big hits on it, so that's pretty exciting to hear and review. So stay tuned for that, and as always, stay minty.